Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal. I want to continue talking about the Catholic liturgical crisis that we're in, or at least I consider it a crisis. And I want to hone in on the issue of the positioning of the presider, the celebrant, the priest, and also the positioning of the people. I want to hone in on the importance of the positioning of those celebrating or assisting at the sacrifice of the Mass. For the last 60-ish years since the Second Vatican Council, and of course there were examples of this happening before the Second Vatican, many places in the Church have celebrated the Mass in the form, in the orientation of versus populum, meaning facing the people, where the priest faces the people and the people face the priest. So they're facing each other. This, I think, initially was kind of sprouted from the idea of the Mass being a meal and the altar being a table. Now, of course, the Mass is a meal, the altar is a table, but is it primarily that? I will argue it is not primarily a meal, and the altar is not primarily a table. But first I want to talk about some more general principles about this. I want to talk about the principle of worship. Worship is what man gives to God. And the most timeless form of worship is sacrifice. Virtually every culture throughout history has had sacrifice to a god or gods as part of its worship. And the orientation of sacrificial worship, and I would argue worship in general, is man facing toward God. Man facing God and giving an offering to God. So it is an outward-looking experience. Worship is man looking outside of himself toward the Godhead. And this orientation is incredibly important. When you kneel down for prayer in a chapel or in a private room, if you are facing something, is it going to be another live human being across from you? Let's say if you were sitting in a chapel and you knelt down for prayer, maybe you're praying the rosary or the liturgy of the hours, or just for private contemplative mental prayer. If someone was sitting in front of you and facing you while you were doing this, let's say in a chapel, would that not be incredibly distracting? If I'm sitting there in the second pew of the church or chapel, I sit down to pray and I'm praying, maybe no one's in front of me at first, and then someone walks into the chapel, and let's say there's chairs in this chapel, not pews, and a person sits down, turns one of the chairs in front of me around, and sits facing with their face towards me. Well, I would initially think either this person has absolutely no idea what they're doing, or this person is insane. Because I'm trying to pray to Almighty God, and this person has set themselves in front of me as really, it would seem like a blockage, as a distraction to my worship. Now, you could probably see where I'm going with this. In a very real sense, I think, this happens to Catholics at Mass. If I'm in prayer and someone sits down in front of me facing me, what would be the appropriate thing to do? Well, it would be to stop prayer and converse with that person in some way. In that conversation, I might say, "What are you doing?" Or, "Please, if you would not mind, I am trying to pray. Would you be able to please face the altar or the tabernacle? Please don't face me. I feel very awkward right now." Something to that effect. So I think when Catholics go to Mass and the priest is facing them, it's a conversational orientation between the priest and the people. Okay? It's a conversational orientation, which means that now the primary mode of communication is not worship. It is horizontal communication between human beings. And, I mean, of course, people at Mass can close their eyes, or they can overcome this, and they can pray to God and offer true worship to God in that sense. The priest can do this. The lay people can do this. But does the orientation of the priest and the people, does it facilitate worship? Or does it facilitate merely human conversation or horizontal conversation? It should come to no surprise to you, sociologically, and I won't say psychologically, because I cannot verify the individual workings of a human's mind, of an individual's mind. But sociologically, this orientation of versus populum emphasizes the conversational nature of the Mass. And not conversation between God and man, which would be worship. No. Conversation between man and man. The priest is not God. He may stand in persona Christi, but the priest is not God. We do not worship the priest. And so, when the conversation is directed between man and man, between the laity and the priest, God is kind of left to the wayside because of the orientation. I think people underestimate the power of body language. People underestimate the power of bodily position. When you have one person facing another, the natural thing that happens is conversation between the two persons. The Mass is supposed to be a conversation between man and God, not man and man. And that is exactly what happens in a versus populum orientation. It hinders. It does not completely make impossible worship, true worship, but it certainly hinders it. It certainly makes it more difficult. Why do we go to Mass? Why do we go to Mass? Is it to create community? Well, yes. Is it to further evangelization and conversation between persons, between human persons? Yes. But what is the main reason we go to Mass? It is divine worship. And if you do not believe that the Mass is primarily for the sake of divine worship, I'm sorry to say, but you are not on the side of the magisterium. Now, I will see if I can compile a list of magisterial evidence for this, but at the moment I am driving, so I cannot. But do your own research. Is the Mass primarily for worship, or is it primarily for community or conversation between human beings? I argue, and I think I have a vast amount of evidence behind me, that the magisterium supports, and not only supports, but proclaims my stance that the Mass is for divine worship. And thus, an orientation where human faces human is a hindrance to divine worship. This is my argument for an Ad Orientum positioning. There is a reason why every other rite within the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church is made up of, I believe it is 24 rites. 24 rites, and I think, 24 particular churches, and I think 8 or 10 different rites. Okay. I think that it is clear that an orientation where man faces God is necessary.